So the very first thing, if you're taking notes, ordinary world changers are the people that will look at a situation and take the time to stop and sit down to cry. Ordinary world changers stop and sit down to cry. See, this is the very first thing that we see Nehemiah do in response to the news of Israel's plight in chapter 1, isn't it? His very first response in verse 4. Let's look at it again, what it says. It says, when I heard this, Nehemiah says, I sat down and wept. I sat down and wept. What's interesting to me, though, is that this is not an isolated response that we see only from Nehemiah. Fast forward to the New Testament and to the person of Jesus, who we claim to follow. Jesus himself, on a number of occasions, when he saw a certain situation that was just not okay, he was moved to tears. For example, when he learned that his friend Lazarus had died. It's fascinating because even knowing of his ability and even his intention to raise him from the dead, Jesus ultimately went and raised Lazarus from the dead. He knew he could do it, and he knew he probably would do it. And yet, when he saw that situation, he wept. When he heard of Lazarus' death, he sat and he wept. On another occasion, we read about Jesus as he approached the city of Jerusalem for what would be his final week on earth. And as he's making his way down the mountainside into the city of Jerusalem, and people are surrounding him waving palm branches, crying out, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. He looks over the city of Jerusalem and he weeps. And the scripture talks about the fact that he's weeping because it was full of people who just didn't get it. They just didn't get it. He says they were like sheep without a shepherd. And it broke his heart. And he sat and he wept. But here's what you need to understand. It's not about the weeping. It's really not. It's not like if you sit down and have a good cry every now and again that you're going to change the world. What's relevant and what's important, it's the internal turmoil that led to the weeping that's significant. Something was so stirred inside of them that they were overcome with emotion. I mean, there are plenty of other stories that don't talk about Jesus necessarily weeping or crying, but talk about the fact that he was moved with compassion. I love those words. Look, take a minute, take some time sometime and look throughout the New Testament and the stories of Jesus, and you'll find this consistent theme that over and over again, before Jesus performs a miracle, the scriptures will very often say that he was moved with compassion. And then he performs some miracle. If you look at the original language and that word that's translated, that phrase that's translated moved with compassion, literally talks about this churning, this turning of the inside. Like literally his gut was in pain, like he could feel it on the insides of him. There was this internal anguish that moved him to do something about it. And so Jesus would look into a messed up situation and his heart would break and he would say to himself, this is not okay. Someone has got to do something about this. And it might as well be me. And now, fast forward all these years later, Jesus has commissioned us, his followers, to continue on the work which he began. We see it in Matthew 28. We talked about it last week when Jesus gathered his disciples together and he said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, you go and make disciples of all nations. Continue the work that I've been doing. Like we talked about last week, the work of God in restoring all things to God. That's what he was about. He was about looking at what are the situations, what are the things that are not the way God intended them to be, and restoring them back to the way that they were supposed to be. Our call as Christ followers is to recognize those situations that are not what God intended them to be, Situations like poverty and hunger and disease and addiction and homelessness and abandonment and divorce and abuse. All of these situations that we look into, and the list could go on and on and on, and we look at those things, we recognize those situations that are not what God intended them to be, and we make a decision to say, I'm going to get involved in restoring them to the way that God intended them to be. That's the work of Jesus. That's how God's kingdom comes here on earth, even as it is in heaven. See, heaven, we see this great picture in the book of Genesis, in the story of creation. You see this perfect creation where God and man and humanity and all of creation is in perfect relationship with God. And then all of a sudden sin comes into the picture and it messes all of that up. Not just our relationship with God, but all of creation is affected by sin. And you see the results of that today in the broken world we live in, and all of the things that I just listed, and so many more things. There's brokenness all around us. We look around at the world and we say, this could not have been what God had in mind. All of this poverty and brokenness and hurt and pain and hatred and bitterness and loneliness and abuse and divorce and broken relationships, this cannot be what God had in mind. And the truth is it's not. It's a result of sin. And everything that God has been doing since the time of creation up until now and until Jesus returns again and the new heaven and the new earth come, everything is about restoring things back to the way they were supposed to be. And you see that picture when Jesus comes in His second coming, and the new heaven and the new earth come, and we're restored, and the kingdom of heaven is here in its fullness. You see a picture of that again. Look at the story of creation and look at the story of the new heaven and the new earth in the book of Revelation. You'll see a lot of similarities, because finally the work of God is done in restoring all these things. But the cool part is we get to be a part of the in-between. Jesus came and began this great work of saying, look, all of these situations, and you see Jesus walking around. We make a big deal a lot of times out of the physical healings, because that's one thing that's not the way God intended it to be. There's not supposed to be disease and sickness, and there won't be when we get to the new creation. The new heaven and the new earth. There won't be disease and sickness anymore. That's one thing. But Jesus, over and over again, He's spoken to people's lives. He looked at situations that were not the way God intended them to be and said, doggone it, this is not okay. And I'm going to be a part of making it okay again, restoring it. And Jesus came preaching over and over again, the kingdom of heaven is not somewhere far off in the distance. The kingdom of heaven is where? What did He say? At hand. The kingdom of heaven is near. It's at hand. It's right here amongst you. Why is it here amongst you? Because we're a kingdom people who are about taking things that are not the way they're supposed to be and restoring them back to the way they were supposed to be. So every time we look into a situation that's not what God intended it to be, and we stand up and we say, this is not okay, I'm going to do something about this, and we get involved, and we're ministers of restoration, we're leaders of change and restoration, and we're about restoring things back to the way it was supposed to be. That's an instance where God's kingdom has come here to earth. And it's in those moments that we experience, in the greatest ways ever, the glorious presence of God. Because that's what it's about. Maybe another way to state this principle would be this. Ordinary world changers allow the things that break the heart of God to break their own hearts. God, what are the situations, what are the things that you look at and your heart just breaks? You say, that's just not okay. And that we would allow those same things to break our hearts, that this internal turmoil, this stirring of our guts, this pain deep within us that Nehemiah felt and Jesus felt, that we would feel that in the depths of us when we look at those situations. And it would move us. It would overwhelm us. To the point where maybe sometimes all we can do is just sit and weep. It's not okay. See, this is the place we begin in impacting and changing the world around us. It doesn't start by mustering up enough strength and discipline to simply do the right thing. You can do that for a while. Ultimately, it's not going to get you very far, and you're going to burn out, and you're going to get tired. But when you feel something at the depths of your core, of your being, and core of your soul, and nobody can ever take that away from you. And it will move you to do things that you never thought you could do. I mean, think about it. Every significant movement for change that has ever taken place in history has started in this place. Every significant movement for change that's ever happened in the history of the world has started in this place. It started with someone who looked at a situation and their hearts broke. And they said, this is not okay. And it compelled them to do something about it. So let me ask you this question, and I don't want to ask it just facetiously and have you glaze over it. I pray that you would take time to really dwell on this. What is it that breaks your heart? What is it that breaks your heart? What is it that you look at in the world and say, that situation, that's not okay. I'm not okay with that. Somebody has to do something about that. What is that thing for you? And let me say this, and hear me when I say this. When you figure that out, please, please, please don't run from it. Because that's our tendency. You will have a tendency to want to run and run and run. We want to run and hide because the truth is, I don't want to feel pain. I don't want to ache in that sort of way. It hurts. It's painful. It's not fun. But I'll tell you, embracing that ache in your heart and allowing yourself to feel the pain of another is the place that we begin in really following in the footsteps of Jesus. Until you've gotten to that place, I'm not sure that we totally get and understand what it means to follow Jesus until we learn to embrace that. Being part of reconciling an incredibly broken world to God. What is it that breaks your heart on God's behalf? Maybe for you, you have a hard time even identifying that ache in your heart, and that's okay. Maybe you haven't really felt it. And maybe for you, the place to begin is simply asking God to let you see the world around you as He sees it. That's a great prayer to pray. A dangerous one, mind you, but a great one to pray. I believe with all my heart that God longs for us to impact the world around us. And if we're serious about it, I believe God will open our eyes to see the world around us as He sees it. And the things that break His heart will begin to break our hearts. So Nehemiah, he heard about the plight of his people, and he sat down and wept. But he didn't stop there. Principle number 2 that we learned from the story of Nehemiah is that ordinary world changers are those who kneel down to pray. Ordinary world changers are those who kneel down to pray. Look at verse 4 in its entirety again. He says, when I heard this, I sat down and wept. He says, in fact, for days I mourned, fasted, and prayed to the God of heaven. See, this is not a situation where we sit and say, oh man, I feel bad for those people on the other side of the world that have no food. And we have a quick 5-minute cry session for them and say a quick prayer, and then we're on our merry way and back to life. Nehemiah says, for days he mourned, fasted, and prayed to the God of heaven. I know all sorts of people who would say, well, what can I do? What in the world can I do about this big need? I'm just one person. Ever been there? I'm just one person. Or we're just one little family, or we're just one little life group. What in the world can we do about this big, enormous need? Let me tell you just what you can do. You can pray. You can pray to the God of heaven. Let me tell you, some of the most important time you'll ever spend on earth is when you seek God in prayer. But I'm only one person. I'm here to tell you that God plus one is always a majority. God plus one is always a majority. Every single time, God plus you equals a majority.